Good evening, my name is DK, and I've recently returned from an unexpected and rather protracted stay in the spirit world. And despite some major hurdles, I was eventually able to learn the language spoken by those of the departed who reside there. Notwithstanding the dozens of emails I have received from spirit mediums attempting to buy my silence, I now present to the world the culmination of my research, the language of ghosts, henceforth referred to by the exonym Polterguese. We begin with phonology. You might wonder why ghosts would even need a language of their own, rather than simply continuing to speak the languages they spoke in life. The answer is very simple. No human languages are physically pronounceable to ghosts. Yes, it seems that among the many things robbed of us all upon our departure from the living world is the efficacy of our vocal anatomy. You might be familiar with this kind of diagram of the human vocal tract. After careful observation, I believe that the ghostly vocal tract looks something like this. Ghosts have no teeth, no noses, and no tongues. The bottom of the mouth is fused solid and immovable, leaving only a small amount of control over what appears to be a vestigial tongue radix. Also, while ghosts do possess lips, they can't spread their lips wide open as humans can, which causes all Poltergeese sounds to be articulated with rounded lips. With that in mind, Poltergeese has the following consonants: b, a, v, h, h, w. Now, because ghosts don't have tongues, they only have one conventional vowel sound. From an articulatory perspective, this sound is equivalent to Schwa, but the constrained shape of a ghost's mouth causes it to sound closer to oo in practice. This vowel can be pharyngealized, which often induces tense or creaky voice, and it can also take any of 9 different tones. Syllables in Poltergeese are at most CV, but nucleus-only syllables are quite common. The sounds h and h can be used syllabically, but only if the syllable they're in either has no onset or the onset is a stop. Note that these syllabic consonants get their own letters in my romanization. The phonotactics I'm showing on screen are accompanied by sandhi rules that operate between morphemes within a word. There are also a few ordinary allophones too. Poltergeese also has regressive vowel harmony. Pharyngeal vowels induce pharyngealization in preceding vowels, and non-pharyngeal vowels remove it. Glottal consonant onsets are transparent to the harmony, while other consonants, including the syllabic glottal, are opaque to it. Now, I'd like to move on to morphology, but first, we need to talk about magic. Ghosts can do magic. I'll explain how later. There are a number of active blessings and curses that can take effect if their conditions are met, with curses being particularly frequent. Sometimes these blessings and curses can have an effect on the language itself. Many curses have been placed on specific semantic concepts, making it hazardous to refer to them directly. For instance, this word, which means snakes, will inflict the pain of lethal envenomation if spoken aloud. Because the effect is triggered by the semantics of the word, synonyms also carry the curse. Euphemisms can be used to circumvent this, but only if they are ambiguous enough to stay semantically distant from the source of the curse. I don't know what the line is for this, but I'm not about to go trying random phrases to find out. My advice, just stick to the euphemisms that are proven safe. For instance, this lengthy phrase is one of a few common euphemisms used to safely refer to snakes, and it literally translates to ones of hiding in the grass. A word of warning, if a euphemism becomes so widely used that it effectively becomes synonymous with the cursed word, it can retroactively inherit the curse. I'll be marking curse euphemisms with guillemets in my glosses. A quick note on syntax. Poltergeese has extremely free word order. Like, words can usually even be mixed up between clauses. However, the usual word order in practice is verb, subject, object, with words and phrases that modify nouns following the nouns they modify, and words that modify verbs, as well as dependent clauses, usually come after the verb and its arguments. This is only the default though, and it's quite common for speakers to change word order around, often for emphasis. Alright, let's talk nouns. The minimally inflected noun consists of a lexical root, a case, and a fusional agreement suffix. For example, to place the word for ghosts in the genitive case, we put the genitive marker in between the root and its agreement suffix. So what do these agreement suffixes encode? Well, Poltergeese has grammatical animacy. But of course, for a language spoken by ghosts, a simple animate-inanimate split isn't very useful. Polterguese instead encodes 5 animacy categories: animate, inanimate, deanimate, reanimate, and neuter. The categories on screen are the usual allotments, but there are of course several exceptions. These animacies combine with a 3-way grammatical number distinction to form the 13 agreement suffixes. Except, I explained magic before nouns for a reason. The word for the number 1 is cursed. As a result, the grammatical singular is also cursed. This results in the modern language having a 2-way dual and non-dual grammatical number distinction. As for case, there are 12 total noun cases, which Polterguese grammarians traditionally sort into 4 sets. Most of these cases are familiar and work mostly in the way you'd expect, but the captive case stands out. This case is used to mark possession, but like the ghostly kind. It marks nouns that are being haunted. Anyways, adjectives agree with the nouns they modify using all of the same affixes. So if we add this adjective, which is the distal demonstrative, you can see how it essentially copies its noun's inflections. While we're here, pronouns work exactly the same as normal nouns, although their roots actually have separate dual forms in the second and third person. Polterguese is highly pro-drop, so pronouns are most often just used for emphasis. There are also honorific and pejorative forms, allowing pronouns to encode politeness or rudeness. And that's everything for nouns. There's nothing else. Nouns are done, it's just those 2 simple affixes, we have nothing more to worry about. Let's talk about verbs. To begin, all verbs exhibit polypersonal agreement. So if we take this verb root, which means to have, and we want to conjugate it for a first-person non-dual animate subject with a third-person dual inanimate object, we add these affixes. For number and animacy, verbs just use the exact same agreement markers that we just saw with nouns and adjectives, which makes it nice and easy. As for person, most of the subject markers resemble the pronoun roots, even down to having honorific and pejorative forms. But a couple of the forms are somewhat different, and there are also separate accusative forms for the object. Now before we move on, another tangent, time is weird, especially for ghosts. Ghosts experience frequent visions of different points in time. These visions may be visual or just auditory, and are the primary method used by spirit mediums to attempt to predict the future. However, these visions aren't always very comprehensible. Ghosts can't always distinguish between visions of the past and visions of the future. And visions of the future don't always come to pass. What's worse, ghosts can't always recognize when they're having a vision, and may get them confused with the present. This all makes ghosts have a very strange relationship with the flow of time. So while Polterguese does have a tense system, encoding time relative to the present isn't always easy for ghosts who aren't always certain when the present actually is. Instead, Polterguise's tenses are based on fixed points in time. The mortal tense is used for events that take place after the speaker's death, and the vital tense is the opposite, while the moribund tense marks the time shortly before or during the events of the speaker's death. Of course, the mortal tense is always in the future for us living folks, while the vital is always in the past for ghosts. These tense suffixes are joined by a pair of voice prefixes, though apparently those are traditionally treated as derivational for some reason. They do behave a little differently from other verbal affixes, as I'll touch on later, so I kinda see the reasoning. Anyways, if we come back to our example from before, we can add the vital suffix to our verb. Polterguese also has 5 grammatical moods. The indicative is, well, just the indicative. The subjunctive appears most often in dependent clauses and lets a clause take on the role of a noun. Using the subjunctive in an independent clause seems to mark a vague deontic modality and is most often used in the second person as a sort of imperative. The conditional mood is of course mainly used to form conditional clauses, but when used independently, it acts like an interrogative mood. Now the optative and imprecative are interesting. They both mark hopes or wishes, but the optative is generally positive while the imprecative is specifically malicious. It's crucial to note though, anything you say in these 2 moods apparently has a small chance of happening for real. This is how those blessings and curses happen. I can't find clear information on exactly how it works, but apparently different kinds of wishes may be more or less likely to come true. However, I'm told that you can repeat these invocations as many times as you want to increase the odds. It's considered polite in ghost society to echo optative sentences whenever you hear one spoken, even if you don't know the person saying it or why they're saying it. I've even heard that some ghosts gather together in large groups to repeatedly chant an invocation to maximize their odds. This seems to be the way that the most powerful blessings and curses come to be. Now, these moods combine with 4 grammatical aspects: imperfective, perfective, gnomic, and something I'm calling quietive aspect. I'll explain that one in a second. These 4 inflected aspects are part of a larger set of 12 composed aspects, traditionally sorted into 3 families by 4 ranks. The remaining aspects in each family are formed by starting with the family's inflected aspect, imperfective, perfective, or quietive, and adding some additional words. Some of these constructions are only valid for telic verbs. The progressive is familiar, but the regressive aspect is the reverse, describing an action that moves away from its endpoint. This may be used to describe a process that is actively being undone, but it's also used to relay the contents of certain visions where time appears to flow backwards. The cyclical aspect, meanwhile, conceives of an action as repeatedly progressing and regressing. Like the gnomic, this doesn't imply a known start or end point, so it can create a sense of timelessness. If you put the sentence "the sun rises" in the cyclical construction, it would mean something like "the sun always rises and sets." The inceptive and terminative are familiar, but note that the terminative aspect here specifically indicates that an action is completed. That's in contrast to the quietive aspect, which simply says that an action stops, but implies incompleteness for telic verbs. There's also the neglectative, which is for actions that nearly start happening. The errative aspect is its reverse, focusing on actions that almost get completed. Finally, the extinctive aspect. It's used for events that seem eternal, but then stop anyway. So while the gnomic allows you to say "the sun rises," and the cyclical allows for "the sun always rises and sets," the extinctive would be used for "the sun stops rising forever." Alright, we can come back to our example verb and add the quietive indicative marker. These aspect mood affixes always go immediately after the verb root. And finally, we have a finite verb. It's 13 syllables long, and on its own it can stand for the complete sentence "while I live, we stop having the 2 of them." However, time is still weird. Unexpected auditory visions can seriously impact the flow of conversation. At any point, words being spoken in a different conversation in the past or future could insert themselves into the dialogue, and they may drown out the actual words being said in the process. What's worse, I've been told that apparently visions have started getting much more common in the last couple centuries, and no one's really sure why. So how do Poltergeese speakers identify and dismiss interloping words, and how do they fill in the words that get lost in transmission? The answer is, of course, redundancy. Our verb from before already exhibits agreement with both of its arguments, which is why we were able to drop them. But what happens if we add an adjunct? If we want to add a causal noun to create the sentence "while I live, we stop having the 2 of them because of pitifulness," the relationship between these words is completely unmarked, and a vision here could eliminate crucial meaning. To get around this, we add what's called a reduced noun agreement affix onto the verb. So now the verb explicitly says that it expects a non-dual neuter causal adjunct. These affixes exist for every combination of animacy and case, and there are also dual forms for the animacies that have a dual. So, is this sentence redundant enough now? If we imagine that the noun gets lost in transmission, we can now no longer tell exactly what caused the action, but the causal relationship itself is preserved, and we even know the number and animacy of the missing noun. However, if the verb is lost, we lose most of the information in the sentence. To get around this, we can echo the verb's person agreement markers into the noun. So now the noun relays the person of the subject and object. Hold on though, the dropped verb is supposed to be a quietive, something that stops happening, but this crucial information is totally absent now. To fix this, we add a reduced verb agreement affix onto the noun. The noun now records the tense, aspect, and mood of the verb. Without the verb, we might not know exactly what's happening, but we do now know who's involved and how it happens. Just like the reduced noun markers, there's one of these reduced verb markers for every valid combination of tense, aspect, and mood. These markers are applied to all nouns, even to arguments. So in this sentence, which means "as my death approaches, wretched zombies are chasing us," we can see how even if we drop the subject, we still know its number, animacy, and even politeness. If we drop the verb, we still have enough information to guess at it from context. Okay, but what happens when nouns modify other nouns? If we take this word, a common insult that means something like "worthless fool," and we want to qualify it with an inessive to generate the phrase "worthless fools in the abysses," how do we ensure that the relationship remains clear? First, the modified noun takes a reduced noun agreement just like we saw with verbs. And second, the modifying noun exhibits case stacking, taking the case suffix as well as the agreement suffix from the noun it modifies and placing them directly after its own case and agreement. As a result, this noun is now marked as being in both the inessive case and the nominative case. Of course, if we were to add a third noun modifying this one, it would have to be marked for its own case and the inessive and the nominative. Now hold on though, genitive nouns can't modify verbs. As a result, there are no reduced to genitive agreements. So while genitive nouns themselves just case stack like the others, how does a noun modified by a genitive mark the relationship? Passive personal possession markers. These are used to agree with all genitives, even if they're not possessive genitives. The person marker table I showed earlier actually had an extra row the entire time, but I hid it from you at the time because I enjoy lying to you. This means that nouns uniquely mark the person of a modifying genitive, which they don't do for the other cases. Okay, so what about dependent clauses? Here, we want to have a content clause acting as the direct object of the verb for to suppose, but it's not clear exactly how the parent clause should mark object agreement. What is the number and animacy of a content clause? Well, the parent clause should agree with the subject of its dependent clause. However, this relationship is still only one way. How should the dependent clause agree with its parent? Nice and simple, we just add a reduced verb agreement. All done. All of this redundancy can very easily create extremely long words, like this one word I borrowed from my translation, which, out of context, means while I live, they do so to them, with the two of them, through them, of being led. Now, since we've already seen how much meaning gets preserved even if words are missing, it should come as no surprise that a common way to cut back on these lengthy words is to simply drop any of them that aren't strictly necessary. This means that Polterguese isn't just pro-drop, it's anything drop. Even in a long sentences with multiple embedded clauses, you can always drop the sentence down to a single word and still preserve a large portion of the syntax tree. Now, just a few quick things to go over. Any verb root can be inflected as a noun. When you do this, telic verbs are inflected as inanimate nouns, and atelic verbs are considered neuter. These verbal nouns can still take voice prefixes, but otherwise they behave exactly like other nouns. There are also some special modifier affixes. Apparently most of these came from old particles that can be affixed on individual words, but the increasing need for redundancy now means they now have to be applied to every word in a clause. They cover things like negation, an intensifier, a mirative, and an interrogative marker. Numbers are fairly normal. They're counted in base 13. But the numerals, which we'll check out in a minute, are bijective, so there's no numeral for 0. Remember that the number 1 is still cursed, so a common euphemism uses a negated subjunctive verb acting as a genitive, creating the meaning of that they don't join. Also, there is, or at least was, a copula. It connects two nominative arguments, but it can also more rarely be monovalent, just like the verb to be in other languages. As far as I can tell, it's essentially always dropped in the modern spoken language, since you already know a sentence is copular anytime two nominatives share the same verb agreement. That said, it is still used in writing. Speaking of which, writing. The simplest way to write in Polterguese is to use the vocalic script, which has 20 characters for all possible syllable nuclei, and no characters for onsets. It's kind of like an abjad, but the other way around. Keep an eye out, there are a few lookalike characters here, but most of them are nice and distinct. This system isn't really ideal though. If you take this example sentence from earlier, even without writing the consonants, this two-word sentence is a bit too long to write comfortably. If you imagine a longer sentence, like this one that means as my death approaches, the gods of the universes leave us to decay in these abysses, you can imagine how slow it would be to write this in the vocalic script. But hold on, most of this sentence is just inflection. If we highlight the roots here, you can really see how short the lexical content really is, especially if we discard the consonants. And really, most of that inflection only exists to combat information loss from intrusive visions, which isn't nearly as much of a problem in writing. That's why the most common writing system is Polterguese logo vocalic writing. It combines the 20 vocalic characters with 15 inflectional logograms, plus the numerals, and a very unique orthography to put it all together. Let's try writing this sentence in PLVW. We start by drawing a large circle, intersected on its leftmost point by a smaller one, and put the vocalics for just the root of the verb in the middle. In the left circle, we put a logographic character that marks the tense and aspect of the verb, which in this sentence is the moribund perfective. Then we place another circle with the root vocalics for the subject, and if the verb is transitive, we also need one for the object. Note here that even though the object is dropped in the original sentence, it still gets written. The subject is normally placed 72 degrees clockwise from the tense aspect marker, and the object is a further 72 degrees away from the subject, tracing out the first 2 points of a 5/2 star polygon, more commonly called a pentagram. Continuing this pattern, we place any other nouns that modify the verb in the remaining spaces. Noun cases marked by the shape that contains the noun alongside extra logograms to differentiate related cases. Here, this adjunct is inessive, so it's placed in a square to mark the locative family of cases, and we place this little curly symbol outside the square to specify the inessive. If you have too many adjuncts to fit into the pentagram, you can use another star polygon like a septagram or a nonagram, as long as it has a turning number of 2. When nouns modify nouns, we simply intersect them. You can tell this new noun is a genitive because it's in a circular frame that isn't directly attached to any verb. Adjectives are placed outside the frames for the nouns they modify. The same is true for the numerals. Likewise, voice prefixes and special modifiers can either be placed along the main verb circle or placed outside the tense aspect circle. Now, I haven't mentioned grammatical mood yet. This sentence is in the indicative, but if I do this, it becomes the subjunctive. Mood is traditionally marked with the writing medium. Indicative clauses should be written in ink, charcoal, graphite, or really any other normal writing material. After that, the subjunctive is written in chalk or salt, the conditional in copper, the optative in gold, and the imprecative in blood. If you can't use the correct materials, it is acceptable to simply use colors, like I'll be doing here since I'm doing this on a computer screen. But note that the magical effects of the optative and imprecative only really work if the proper materials are used. Oh no. It's time. Hey, thanks for making it to the end. That translation was so awful to read that I went out into the woods to read it so that I wouldn't bother anyone. Shout out, by the way, to the crow that came by and started crowing away while I was out here, which gave me a great source of extra background audio. Speaking of, the background music, if you can call it that, was also made by me in like 10 minutes so that there wouldn't be silence in the background. If you can hear twigs crackling beneath my feet, it's because I'm still in the woods